Life's kicking you in the teeth right now and you don't know what to do, but let me tell you this, everything always happens for a reason. Recently, I've been on a lot of other podcasts and I've been creating a little bit more content for people to consume. And one of the questions that I'm frequently getting is just asking how I came into football, how I started, how I came to the United States. And so I love to tell the story, and I'll tell the story today because it's so critical to understanding how I developed an attitude and a perspective that everything happens for a reason. So I'll take you back to, I grew up in Canada, middle of 5 children, and my entire life and identity when I was a kid was sports. Athletics was everything. So I went from baseball to basketball to track to volleyball to, it didn't matter what it was. I was constantly in and or overlapping in multiple sports. And so that was like, after school, that was everything that I did. It was everything I looked forward to. I found journals actually from like my elementary school with my wife, and we were reading through it. And it was funny because every single page, all I did was write about what practices and games I had after school. And that's all I really thought about. So it seems silly, but that at a time where that was your whole life, that's exactly all that consumed me. So the story starts in my childhood in Canada, where I was going to school, and because I was playing all these sports, I actually had just made the senior volleyball team in junior high. And because in Canada, junior high is 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, I had already been on the senior team in my 8th grade. And now going into the 9th, I was kind of known throughout the group as like the potential captain, the guy that had already been on the team the year before. And there was one other player just like me. And so we went to tryouts, and we had these tryouts, and they were growing great. But after about 4 or 5 days of tryouts, we still had like 15 players. And a couple of the other players on the team who were maybe on the borderline of getting cut or walking on eggshells, they didn't really want to ask the teacher. And so they asked me, they said, hey, when are we going to make the rest of the cuts? When's coach going to make the rest of the cuts? And they wanted me to ask the coach. And so I actually went to the coach after practice, and I said, hey, when are we gonna make the rest of these cuts, coach? And she said, hey, everybody come in, gather around, and sit down. And so the whole team came together, we sat down, and I remember really clearly, she said, I need everybody to close their eyes, and nobody open their eyes. But I'm gonna ask you a question. So we all sat down, we closed our eyes, and she said, anybody that thinks that we should make more cuts, please raise their hand. And so me, thinking, that we should have a couple less players so that we all have more playing time and just meeting the standards of the game, I raised my hand. And she said, everybody open your eyes, and whoever raised your hand is cut. And it was me and the other kid that had been on the team the year before. We were the only 2 players that raised our hands. And it was devastating, like literally devastating. I know it sounds silly because it's just a kid and it's just sports, but I went home and I remember I was just crying, like I was bawling to my mom. I was walking up our staircase, and I remember getting like 3 steps before the top, and I was sitting down the stair with my back up against the wall, and I was just sobbing. And my mom came and sat beside me, and she put her hands like on my knees, and she was like, it's okay, honey, it's all right. And I'm like, no, it's not okay, my life's over, I hate this, I can't believe this happened to me, it's the worst thing in the world. And I truly felt that way. Like I remember being like completely just broken. And I remember my mom grabbed me by the face, and she pulled my face up, and she looked in my eyes, and she said, Aaron, don't worry, son, everything happens for a reason. And obviously at the time, nothing hit me. It was just devastation and no, there's no good reason, I hate this, and a lot more crying. And I remember going away from that and just feeling like my life was really disrupted. And I found myself after school coming home and just being bored out of my mind. I didn't know what to do with free time because I was typically just playing sports the whole time. And you can only shoot hoops in your driveway by yourself for so long. And I recognized that like my brother wasn't there even to do it, my little brother, because he was at practice. And it was interesting because he was at football practice. And in our family, growing up in Canada, like nobody really knows anything about football, right? So like I didn't even know the rules of football. I didn't know why you would punt versus kickoff. I didn't know how many points were scored on a touchdown versus a field goal. I didn't know anything about the downs or distances. Like it was completely foreign. It was literally like if you've ever taken somebody that doesn't know anything about football to a game and they just they tell you it just looks like everybody running around in big piles and tackling and jumping on each other. That's what I thought football was in 8th grade. So I remember finding myself completely just bored out of my mind. And so I decided to ride my bike down to the local park where my little brother was having practice. And my little brother, like out of the blue, decided he wanted to play football because he was a tough kid. He's always been a scrapper, and I beat the shit out of him my whole life. And he was good he wanted to go play football. And so I remember going down and just kind of like watching his practices, and I got just watching and trying to understand it. And once in a while, a ball would come over my way, and I'd pick it up and I'd throw it back, or I'd kick it, or this or that. And one of the days, the coach said, "Hey man, like, do you want to come over and run some plays? Like, we had a couple players not show up." And I was like, "Okay." And I'd run track, and I was athletic, so I'd get the ball, and he'd throw it to me, and I'd run for a touchdown. And after a while, he was like, "Man, you're pretty good at this. Like, why don't you play with us?" And obviously, I was like ecstatic. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, but I figured like, hell yeah, I'll play with you. Like, I'm bored out of my mind. I'd love to be a part of the team. And so this is 9th grade, and played for like a little bit. I mean, I didn't even know how to put my pads on or anything like that. Didn't do much, but played a few plays here and there. And then going in my 10th grade, which in high school, in Canada, high school is 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, I started playing football, and I tried out for the team. I was tall, super skinny, probably like 160 pounds, 6 foot, 150 pounds maybe, and just kind of lengthy, but I could run. And so they had me playing some football, and things were good. And as I progressed, obviously my passion, my sport was basketball, but I wasn't good enough at it to go on to the next level. But I remember thinking to myself, like, man, this is kind of crazy. Like, I just totally gave up volleyball. Now I'm playing football, and I'm getting better at it, and I'm enjoying it. And I had a really tight-knit group of friends. There's about 5 or 6 of us, and we're still close today. And I remember the very first football game that I'd ever seen on TV was a college football game. It was actually Virginia Tech versus Florida State. It was a national championship. It was Peter Warwick versus Michael Vick, which were like 2 phenoms. I mean, these guys were just like unbelievable players. Every time they touched the ball, it was just like scoring potential. And I believe they were playing in the Rose Bowl. I mean, this is so many years, 20-some years ago. But I remember the College Stadium they were playing in, the announcer, we were all sitting in my friend Parker's basement, and we were watching this game, and the announcer was like, "Hey, and there's 126,000 people here today to watch this game," and da-da-da. And we like looked around, we were like, holy crap, like, dude, there's 120-some thousand people watching a college football game, which growing up in Canada, that was like unheard of. Like at our football games, we're lucky if we had 20 people come, And so this was just like kind of mind-shattering for us at the time. And I remember watching the game and seeing this crowd just like going nuts over every play. And one of my teammates, or one of my buddies, at the time, he like turned around and he was like, "Man, could you imagine playing football in the United States of America and like in front of all those thousands of people?" And I remember like hearing him say that and watching the crowd and thinking in my mind, like, that would be unbelievable. Like that would be the pinnacle. And without thinking too much, I just blurted out, "I'm gonna do that." And that's just like, for anybody that knows me, my friends that know me really well, when I was a kid, especially like that cocky young Aaron, I would always do stuff like that. I was like, people would throw stuff out and I'd be like, "I can do it, I'll do it, I'll try it." And that came out of my mouth like instinctively. And because I was so prideful, and because I had just essentially committed to my closest friends that no matter what, I was gonna do this. I told them I could do it and I was gonna do it. I was like committed at that point. And I had no way or shape or knowledge on how to do this. Growing up in Canada and playing football in Canada is so different than the United States of America. So we didn't have any recruiting services. There was no huddle. There was no online forums. There was no social media. My coach, he did not talk to recruiting services or any coordinators or any coaches of the sort. So for me to figure out how to manifest what I had just told my friends that I was going to do and to prove to myself that I was going to do it, I just didn't even know where to start. Again, before the ages of internet, I couldn't even Google how to get a scholarship in the United States and playing college football. But I knew this, I knew that based on my family situation and my parents and our income, that if I didn't get my school paid for, I wasn't going to college. I was likely gonna go work in the oil fields or pump gas or whatever I had to do to make a living, but there was no chance of me going to college, and especially in the United States, if I didn't figure out a way to pay for it. So after that commitment, I remember I went down right across from our local mall. There was a place called the Park Place Shopping Center, Park Place Mall, and there's a bookstore right there in the corner. It was called Chapters Books. And so I went into this bookstore and I found this book. I was looking through all the athletic stuff and I found this book that said, How to Market Your NCAA Student Athlete. And I was like, this is it. This is like the formula of how I'm gonna do it. And so I took like pretty much everything I had saved and bought this book for like 20 bucks. And I remember going back into my room at my little desk in my room by myself, and I just started reading. And I read this book like cover to cover in probably a day. And the back part of the book, I mean, it's not that impressive because the front part's probably only like 100 pages, but the back part of the book is literally every address and coaching name for all the athletic departments throughout the United States. But this book, it kind of detailed like how the recruiting process started and what the timelines were when you send letters versus when recruiting trips can be done. And it just like taught me everything. So I read this thing a couple times back to front, and it said that I had to make like a highlight film. And again, before digital times, like making a highlight film, like I had no way to know how to do that. But I had some good game film from the previous year. Going into my senior year, I had some good tapes. And so what I did was, before DVDs even, we just had VHSs. But I gathered all the VHS of the videos of our games from our coaching staff and the players and anybody I knew that had anything on film. And so I had this pile. I still actually have this box of every VHS tape from my high school football games. And I gathered them all up, and I was able to borrow a VCR from one of my friends, because to make a highlight tape back then, you had to have two VCRs. So you'd hook it up to the TV. I had a VCR that was playing the tape, and I had a VCR right here that was recording with the blank VHS in it. And I have to watch hours and hours of film, and then when I found a play that I thought was like a decent play, I would press play and record, and then stop, and it would stop. And that's how I'd splice or edit today's, highlight reel. And so I did this for hours, days. It took me weeks, just back and forth, like record and stop, record, rewind, stop. And finally I came up with this tape that had probably 10 minutes maybe, or 7 or 10 minutes of like highlight films. And then I put like my best game on it as well. And I remember thinking like, my dad was always a really good marketer. He was really, really good at like coming up with cool marketing ideas. And so I thought like, hey, what can I do to kind of jazz this thing up? And so I went to the local TV station, and I just walked into the station, and one of the guys that was like working the cameras and stuff, I asked him, I said, hey, I've got this highlight film that I made by myself. Could you like put in some cool music into the background or something like that? And he was like, yeah, sure, kid. Like a kid off the street. He just like asked, I just pretty much begged the guy. I said, hey, I can pay you like 20 bucks. And he's like, no, I got this. Super nice guy. He worked for the TV station. He took the tape. He's like, what kind of music do you like? And I was like, Beastie Boys and Welcome to the Jungle. And, and he's like, okay, cool, I got this, Thunderstruck. So he like put all this cool music into the background of my highlight film, and he called me a few days later, and I had my highlight film. And so I made like 30 copies of this VHS tape. And so I just had these stacks, right? And in the back of the book, it would say, here's all the addresses and the names of the recruiting coordinators for those schools. So I started filling out envelopes with all the addresses, writing them all down after school. After I was done football practice, I'd come home and I'd immediately just go to this desk and start writing all the addresses. And I'd start stuffing tapes in these envelopes, which I had to pay for. And then I started mailing them all out. And so I mailed them to like 30 or so plus schools, pretty much all just schools in the Northwest that were close enough to Canada. And I remember in the book, it said, okay, after you send out the tapes, you have to follow up with like phone calls and letters. And so I would write up the letters that it would say, like that would say, hey, I sent my film. I'm introducing myself, Aaron Wagner. I'm from Canada. I play football up here. I'd love for you to take a look at my film. And you send these letters out periodically. So I'd do this. This was like my routine coming home from football practice. I'd come home, I'd do all this, I'd send the letters, I'd mail them out. And then it got to the point where during the period of time that it spelled out, that you really had to get like more aggressive and start making phone calls. This is what your coach was supposed to be doing for you, or your recruiting service per the book. But since I didn't have a coach that was willing to do that, and I sure as hell didn't have any recruiting services, I just figured that was my responsibility too. And keep in mind, I'm like 15 years old. And so I started just making calls to all these schools. And I had the name and the telephone number for the athletic department, and I'd say, hey, can I talk to Coach Doba or Coach Levenseller, the recruiting coordinator? I'd talk to him, and almost every time, the secretary or the gatekeeper would just say, no, I can take a message, or we don't patch them through. They get hundreds of calls a day. Da da da. So I found out really quickly within like 10 or 12 calls that like this wasn't going anywhere. I could leave messages. I mean, I will say the first couple times I just left messages, and I actually thought like, hey, these guys are all just going to call me back. And the next day I come home from practice and I just sit by my phone, like, the landline phone, and I just hoped that it would ring, but it would never ring. And so I realized really quickly, like, for them to take my calls, I'm gonna have to figure out how to be more creative on getting them to answer the calls. So what I started doing was I just started calling those exact same numbers, and the secretary would answer and she'd say, hey, Washington State Athletics or Washington State Football. And I would say, hey, I was just on a call with Coach Doba, but the call just dropped. Can you just patch me through? And she would be like, oh yeah, sorry, honey. I apologize. Let me patch you right through. And I was like, holy shit. I remember this super clearly. This was the first time this happened. I used that pitch and just totally bullshitted my way into it. And when she said, yeah, I'm gonna patch you right through, I was like, oh crap, like nervous, like gut-wrenching nervous, like what am I gonna say to the coach when he answers, right? Sure enough, I get like 2 rings and, hey, this is Coach Doba. And I was like, hey, Coach, stammering. And I'm like, Coach, my name's Aaron. I'm 16 years old. I live in Canada. I just started playing football, but I think I'm really good. I don't know if I'm really good because I've never really played any Americans, but I kick everybody's ass up here, and I really want to play college football. Like, I sent you a highlight tape. Have you seen my highlight tape? And he was like, son, I get 100 tapes a day, and I don't look at that shit unless somebody brings it. Are you a highly recruited athlete? Are you a 4-star? Are you a 5-star? I'm like, Coach, I don't even know what that means, but like, I think I'm good. He's like, hey, I tell you what, son. What'd you say your name was? I said, Aaron Wagner. He's like, okay. And he literally, at that moment, I remember, he took the phone off his face, and he was like, hey, will you go find a kid named Aaron Wagner's tape? And I heard somebody in the background, yeah, okay. So somebody goes, and he's like, hey, just hold on a second. And so I'm just sitting there like, holy crap, this is happening. And somebody went and found the tape, and they bring it to him, and he's like, hey, Aaron, yeah, somebody found your tape. Let me just plug it in real quick. I don't want to take a lot of time, but I'll tell you what. I'll tell you within 3 minutes of watching this film if you're any good or not. I was like, okay, here's the moment of truth, right? So he plugs in the tape, and I remember so vividly, because it was like music to my ears. He was like, oh wow, Like this was what he was saying as he's watching my film, and I remember just like smiling ear to ear by myself in this small bedroom in my apartment where me and my brother and my dad lived, and like literally like almost tearing up because I was so happy that the reaction was like positive, and like it just was validating that like everything I've been working for might manifest itself. And the first thing he said was, hey son, you're a hell of a football player. And I was like, thanks, coach. And he said, why don't you come to our camp? And I said, awesome. So I don't have any money, whatever. Don't worry about that. Just come to our camp. We'll figure all that stuff out. And I remember, dude, I I drove like this 1987 Virago 250cc motorcycle from Canada all the way to the United States, across the border with a backpack on, and to have my cleats and some shorts and a t-shirt by myself. And I showed up at this camp, and I didn't have any equipment because I didn't know you had to bring your own equipment, and I didn't have any. And so luckily they had some extra equipment for the football camp, and I went to the camp, and it was a 2 or 3 day camp. I had nowhere to stay, and I remember at the end of the camp, I won the MVP of the camp, and the coaches were all coming up like, hey man, where are you going on your recruiting trips, and where are you this and that? And I didn't have any plans. I didn't even know how to choose a school or what to choose it off of. And so they told me, hey, you get these 5 recruiting trips, they pay for everything, they fly you out, they put you up in a hotel, they pay for all your food. And I was like, this is awesome. So I selected the 5 schools because once they showed interest and I'd won this at the camp, I had a bunch of other schools now that I was trying to call that would never talk to me. Now all of a sudden were calling me, trying to talk to me. And that just felt amazing. And so I set up my 5 recruiting trips, and I went on some of these trips, and I remember just charging everything I could at the dinners in hopes that because I knew it was all free, I could eat like 15,000 calories at a dinner, and extra all the like fancy expensive drinks that you could never order, if you grew up poor like me. So it was just an amazing experience. And when it came right down to it, I had to choose which school I was going to go to, where I was going to sign my letter of intent. And quite frankly, there was a lot better schools than the school that I signed with in terms of football. But I remember thinking back on that moment when Coach Doba took my call, asked for the tape, and told me that I was a hell of a player. It just resounded in me. I remember thinking like a sense of loyalty, like this dude gave me a chance, And I ultimately ended up signing with Washington State, which at the time wasn't a great school, but that year that I came in, we went on a run and ended up winning Pac-10 conference championships, and we went to the Rose Bowl. We beat Texas in the Holiday Bowl. So it was a really, really good team, produced a ton of NFL caliber players. This was super significant for me because I remember at the time, I was the first player in the history of my province, which is the equivalent of a Canadian or of a US state, to ever go on a full football scholarship to a Pac-10 school. And so it was like history in the making, and it created a little bit of a pipeline, opened up this door for other kids behind me, including my little brother that came here on a full football scholarship and got his school paid for, and many other players after. But the coaches flew up, they met my family, they came and watched me play basketball, they offered me a scholarship, I signed, I came down to the United States as a student athlete, I got my entire school paid for, and it opened up so many doors. And then from there, I was able to even go on from there and play professional football and make a living and create relationships that opened up like unlimited amounts of doors for business and what I've been able to capitalize today. And what's nuts about that is that when you go back to that moment of me raising my hand and coming home and sitting on the stairs crying to my mom and thinking my entire life was over, and my mom looking at me and saying everything happens for a reason, that was like the pinnacle, Like I remember like being paid to play this sport, and my life has just been catapulted into another level, like something that I couldn't even envision. Like I owned the stuff that I had posters of on my walls. And I remember thinking like everything happens for a reason. But it only happens for a reason if we have the right attitude and if we have the right perspective. And my mom had a lot of wisdom, and it's something that I try to teach young people today, is that we're gonna have hardship, we're gonna have hard times, we're gonna have like really, really rough times in our lives. But looking back on the hard times and the rough times in my life, those were by far the most important times in my life. Those were the best times in my life. They were the hardest, but they were the best. They shaped me, they molded me, they gave me what is good in my life. And so I just want to tell everybody, whether you're going through hardship right now, or you're experienced it in the past, or you're trying to get through something tough right now, whether it's a divorce or a relationship issue, whether it's your career, maybe you got fired, it doesn't matter what those things are. If you can get your mind right, if you can get the right perspective and attitude, I promise you that everything does happen for a reason, and that you'll come out of the other side in a much better place. And it happened for me. and it continues to happen for me, and I see it on a daily basis. And I think it's just a prime example of attitude and perspective is everything in life. And you just need to always believe that and always remember that. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. If you found value in it, please share it with those that you care about. And if you want to see more of this stuff, please subscribe.